So hello, everyone. I'm also very honored to be here and present my initial thoughts and findings on the topic. So a little bit of contextualization. So this presentation is part of my research and postdoctoral project of a planning grant, which actually plans a strategy in the academic study of mysticism. So we came up with the title PRISM. It was before we found out that the same actually PRISM kind of title is used for the lab in Leiden University, so not to be confused with that. So it's a different research. So this project is funded by Templeton Religion Trust, and we are developing a grant-making strategy for the next 5 years to fund project on mysticism from different perspectives, including mostly social sciences and humanities, but also other related disciplines. So at this stage, the goal of this project was to galvanize expertise in the academic study of mysticism and forge intellectual foundation for the more strategic evolvement. So these initial findings is part of my joint literature review. It was conducted by me jointly with Professor of Sociology Tiaynen-Qadir, also from Tampere University. So we analyzed key text, highly referenced text on mysticism across different disciplines, including theology, sociology, anthropology, psychology as well, cultural studies, and around 150 titles. And of course, we kind of couldn't notice that there is a very strong connection between mysticism and psychedelics. And this is how we came up with an idea that I would write a separate review on the connection between mysticism and psychedelics. In addition to this, I also have my own personal interest on ethnographic research on ayahuasca retreats in Peru. So the outline of my presentation today is, first I would like to present some perspectives which underpin my overall approach to psychedelics and mysticism. Then I will analyze how the divide between perennialist and constructivist divide in the past was followed by the cultural and clinical divide in the present studies on mysticism and psychedelics, or at least it seems that it's heading to that direction. And then I will also analyze how I think cultural approaches may also complement biomedical approaches in our interdisciplinary pursuit on the studies of mysticism and psychedelics. So my first premise is that I approach psychedelics in a broader historical and cultural context of intoxicants, both today and in the past. As I gathered, not only I, but also many here have been inspired by wonderful research by Mike J. On drugs and Western history, who claims that every society on Earth is a high society. So intoxicants have been used since archaic times. And of course, it seems that also, like some other presenters here, the example of coffee is a very vivid one. So I also would like to kind of touch upon that a little bit. And I think it's very interesting because the example of coffee also kind of provides how intoxicants were used in the past as part of ritualistic and ceremonial practices. So initially it was discovered in Ethiopia in the 9th century. Then it was somehow it made its way to Yemen in the 11th century, where it was used by Sufis in Sufi shrines to stay up all night and immerse in their contemplative practices and ecstatic kind of states, which also, of course, triggered altered states of consciousness, as we call them now. So there's lots of history to that. And of course, if you think about the history of psychedelics, there are some speculations and some research that also claim that some mixture of LSD was used in Eleusinian mysteries, which were very probably the most important and the most known enigmatic mystery rites of antiquity. And again, this is something which I've been also kind of struggling myself. There are different kind of interpretations on how we can actually trace the etymology of the term psychedelics. And for now, I decided to stick to kind of the Greek origins of the term, which, if you kind of translate directly, it will be soul manifesting kind of experience. Of course, mind altering is another alternative. That's kind of a matter of discussion. And another perspective is that, yes, of course, it's very interesting that the history of how mysticism became a subject of research was actually very much intertwined with psychedelics, because it kind of the interest emerged in the end of the 19th century, and then the first formulation of mysticism, now classic definition, although much critiqued, was actually launched by William James, who saw mystical experience as evolving around ineffability, as having a noetic quality, being transient and passive in a way that the subject is open to that experience and receives this experience. And of course, it was during the age of experimentation, and William James himself kind of as having experimented with drugs. So there are many different definitions of mysticism, and in our project, we stick to the one which I'm offering here. Again, it's a subject of discussion. Mysticism can be broadly defined as consciousness of immediate, ineffable, and receptive union with the divine, or ultimate reality. This is the term which psychedelic or philosophers of the psychedelic movement preferred. Again, the term mysticism originates in Eleusinian mysteries, and it can be there are different explanations and interpretations how exactly it came to be used in this context. One of them is that it derives from the term mur, which means to close my eyes or mouth, and it basically refers to the fact that those who were initiated in the Eleusinian mystery rites, they were not allowed to disclose experiences that they encountered under the penalty of death. And of course, the very rite was called mysterion, which means the sacred and secret at the same time. And moving to the next slide. So if you think about the history of how psychedelics were studied as an academic topic, as academically, I think that it's important to kind of emphasize that in many ways, discussions about mysticism and psychedelics evolved or were wavering between two poles, two notional poles, represented by a perennial philosophy and a cultural and social constructivist approach. I prefer the terms reification and relativization. I think they're quite kind of vividly point to the difference between these two approaches. So while perennialists saw mysticism as a core to religious experience, as kind of the refined notion, something which has essential kind of qualities. In contrast, constructivists saw mysticism and approached mysticism as something which is relative to different cultures and which has unique qualities and experienced in different ways. Thus, relativized approach. And of course, we all know that the perennial approach to mysticism and psychedelics starts with Aldous Huxley in his Doors of Perception, where he claimed that mescaline allowed him to see things with my eyes shut, to quote him, and to understand the world of knowers of suchness. It's very interesting that already his approach is quite kind of, if you look at the Doors of Perception through the cultural lens, we could also see many references to the European heritage and Christian figures, symbols, and cross-cultural symbols as well. So mescaline, in a way, kind of enabled him to get deeper understandings of what he already discussed in his perennial philosophy in 1944, which was published before he had his experience with mescaline. And it's also important to understand that the perennial philosophy kind of works on the assumption that there is a common core to all mystical experiences. And this is something which I think made its way to psychology and was developed by Ralph Hood and his colleagues, including his mysticism scale and, of course, mystical experience questionnaire, where drug-induced experiences were somewhat compared to mystical experiences or almost equated with them. And quite soon, we saw the reaction, the critical reaction to such approach, especially by Stephen Katz, who claimed that there are no pure unmediated experiences, and all our experiences, including mystical experiences, are prefigured by religious symbols, concepts, and imageries which we had encountered before or prior to our experience, our mystical experiences. Also, there has been a critique that drug-induced experiences are different from mystical experiences in religious traditions, often acquiring many years of training and contemplation and specific techniques. So, as we all know, after the 30 years of ban and silence on the topic, there was a psychedelic renaissance, and I think that this conference is a vivid example of growing popularity of the topic. So, I won't devote much time to this slide, but I think just a couple of things to mention is that, of course, Michael Pollan's study was very instrumental in popularizing the topic globally, and also a trial in Finland, which with participants, Finnish participants, in the first trial on psychedelics in Finland. Yeah, I will not kind of linger on that much. So, and now I think what we observe is in many ways discussions around psychedelics and mysticism again evolves around the clinical and kind of cultural divide. So, it seems that the clinical approach, which includes biomedical, pharmacological, and psychotherapeutic approaches, which of course disclose different levels kind of ontological reality related to psychedelic experiences, this is a dominating approach. Again, there is a further research on mysticism scale and mystical experience questionnaire adaptation, cultural adaptations, but there is also a critique within. For instance, famous Ante's critique on mystical experience, on the critique of the term itself, where she claims that not all experiences which used to be qualified as mystical experiences can kind of, the term is very kind of, it's a problematic term in itself, having Christian kind of biases, and also which does not often recognize negative effects of psychedelic experiences in this case. And some even claim to decouple research on psychedelics from the mystical altogether, to remain within the mainstream of psychology. And here immediately there was a reaction from the, I would call from the cultural kind of perspective, which includes anthropological, historical, and sociological perspectives. For instance, in terms of the post-colonial critique of psychedelic renaissance on strictly biomedical terms. Here we hear about the psychedelic capitalism, which decouples the use of psychedelics from their original understandings and practices, which were rooted in the indigenous knowledge and ways of life. And of course, there is a critique of the very premises, Western premises of the psychology, modern psychology and psychiatry, which doesn't allow integrating many different ways of approaching psychedelics, culturally different. Of course, it's also important that there has been many research on psychedelics, although not using the same terms, but basically it was about plants, sacred plants and medicines by historians and anthropologists in the cultural and ritualistic use of different types of intoxicants. But there are also interesting emerging studies, particularly by Pedersen in different contexts, on modern uses of psychedelics. These are more or less cultural or kind of anthropological approaches. And of course, I would also think that it's a major kind of critique, but also very balanced approach to the academic study of mysticism and psychedelics comes from Karl Bayer and his analysis of high mysticism in historical and philosophical perspectives. So just very briefly understand that kind of it's not a space to talk about culture, but because culture is a very contested notion in anthropology. I was thinking that I need to position myself before diving into how I think cultural approaches may yield different in-depth understandings of the experiences which connected with mysticism and psychedelics. So my notion of culture is dynamic, fluid. So there is, of course, now in the contemporary transnational, globally interconnected world, there are no isolated cultures, but all cultures are more or less hybrid cultures or transnational cultures. We are all transnational subjects. And I'm also following Clifford Geertz's definition of culture as a holistic template. So there are different types of culture, culture of science, even anthropological, for instance, how we do science in anthropology and how we do science in psychology. There are different cultures of making knowledge production. So, and of course, we still operate with the anthropological notion of culture as a way of life and as a way of thinking. And I think that it's important also to think of science as a cultural space of knowledge production, which was brilliantly illustrated by Bruno Latour in his work We Have Never Been Modern, who claims that modernity constructed the dichotomy between nature and culture and constructed science as universally true and and now, moving to the conclusion, I just would like to kind of point out how I think cultural approaches may help us to answer questions and open different dimensions of the phenomena which otherwise remain neglected or understudied. For instance, cultural approaches may help us to understand how drug-induced mystical experiences are culturally and historically embedded and constructed. And as I already mentioned, I think that Huxley's text can also be analyzed from this perspective. In my view, it's a very mystical text, but also culturally shaped. Another question, how are mystical experiences or psychedelic experiences different and similar to those in religious traditions? And of course, there is a kind of, for instance, the question of modernity. Why do people search for the mystical? Why do they long for this kind of experiences? Because it's very often that people actually don't frame their kind of desires to experience and to try psychedelics for therapeutic purposes. There is something more to it. There is something about the self or going beyond the self or challenging the boundaries of the self. So there is an entire critique of modernity and modern self that can also fit in kind of and help us to understand why it is so popular, these experimentations with psychedelics. Another question, how do mystical experiences differ from spiritual experiences and non-ordinary experiences? And of course, global dimension. It's very interesting that there are many phenomenological studies, but for some reasons, they only kind of disclose the point of view of Western users of psychedelics. And there is not enough research on, for instance, how, let's say, ayahuasca is approached and understood by indigenous curandera, who actually, shaman who actually leads the session. So how do they choose how much ayahuasca brew to give and to whom? How do they make these decisions? So we don't hear much about this perspective. So just the simple question: what happens at the juncture of indigenous cultures and Western ways of knowing, Western personhood? And of course, there is a post-colonial critique: is that we have to be aware of the context where scientific knowledge production takes place. Scientific knowledge production is not neutral. It's not value neutral. It also happens in certain kind of context. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think that this awareness is very important. And it's not only like even the scientific knowledge production, as I mentioned, it varies a lot from country to country and also from discipline to discipline. And thank you very much. I would like to thank you for your attention. This is my information. And I think just one final kind of sentence is that I believe that cultural approaches are important to complement biomedical approaches to move to a more holistic, interdisciplinary understanding of the connection between mysticism and psychedelics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions, comments? To expand on the notion that why people search for the mystical experience, where does it come from? Like, people don't want to be who they are. Is it like messages from the society that being you is not the correct way to be, or is it something more deep?
Thank you. I think this is an excellent question. And this is something which I think deserves like probably the entire subfield of research. But I think one of the interpretations is, or how I've kind of encountered and what I've read in the literature, it's a kind of reaction to modernity, the iron cage of modernity, to instrumental rationality, kind of to mechanical ways of the world, mechanical perception of the world. So when people want to experiment with psychedelics and other drugs, is a desire to go beyond the instrumental kind of self, the mechanical self, and to see kind of something beyond it. So I think it's one of the ways to approach it is a critique of modernity. But I'm sure that there are many other ways to analyze and kind of explain why it happens. It would be great to discuss later. Sure.
Thank you for this talk. Richard Saville Smith, who's a religious scholar from a sort of madness studies perspective, is that a lot of these authors on mysticism, with the exception of William James maybe, but especially like Stace and Pankey and others, they really try to sanitize the madness out of mystical experiences, that they really try to formulate this line very strongly, that madness and psychotic type experiences are not mystical experiences at all. But what Saville Smith and others said, we should accept that, it's about the outcomes and it's about how they're integrated and what happens. But really, like, there's no real difference between psychotic experience and a mystical experience, apart from how they affect the person and his functioning in society. But as experiences, we shouldn't try and separate them. What do you think about that?
Thank you. I think this is also a very excellent question. I think that because the kind of mystical experiences are ineffable experiences, it's very difficult to distinguish. And of course, symptomatically, madness and a mystical experience would have probably the same kind of characteristics. But I think that there are 2 points which I think it's important to distinguish. When, for instance, Antaeus, when she's talking about the negative and positive experiences, I think that when it comes to mysticism, it's kind of, it's a double edge and it's a more complicated story. Because of course, shattering experience or negative experiences can also be transformative experiences. So, and where do we distinguish which experiences are kind of beneficial and which experiences are negative? So the same experience can kind of lead to disintegration of the self, and the same experience can lead to the transformation of the self. So I think this is an important question to address and think about.
Thank you for the excellent talk. I'd actually love to hear your answer to one of the questions that you just had up there on the board. How do mystical experiences indeed differ from spiritual experiences and non-ordinary experiences? Because I feel like sometimes these terms can get conflated and used interchangeably, especially the difference between mystical and spiritual experiences. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you. This is an excellent question. And I definitely don't have an easy, it's not an easy question, and I don't have an easy answer. So I think that it's important to answer this question. It's important to strategically define for ourselves as researchers what do we mean by the mystical or by mysticism. And by this definition, if in our project we approach mysticism as a kind of uniting experience, the experiences of unity and connectedness, and the direct presence of the divine or ultimate reality. And I think if you use this definition as a starting point, again, you have to strategically position yourself, but I position myself in this kind of, with this definition, align more. Then I think that some of the experiences, like which don't have this quality, they would be just non-ordinary experiences or spiritual experiences. For instance, if you see like, if you're moved by some religious painting, it's a spiritual experience, but it's not a mystical experience. And even if you are moved by some religious painting and you have a deeper understanding of this painting in your psychedelic experience, it doesn't mean that it's a mystical experience. It just kind of deepens your understanding of that particular painting or figure. So it's a very it's difficult to define. I think that depending on where you stand with your definition of mysticism in your field, I think that will define your kind of approach to where to locate them.
Hi. So, like regarding the constructivist versus the perennialist view, do you think it's possible to resolve this dichotomy and like reach some sort of? What are some possible research methods you could use to like provide answers to whether there is such like a perennial core to these experiences universally in all cultures? Or could you say some more about that?
Thank you for your excellent question. Well, in my view, I think that they don't have to be resolved. They just have to be embraced in our understanding of mysticism and psychedelics. And I think that one of the ways to go is, for instance, to use a critical realist approach, which allows for instance, for the comparison on the ground of family resemblance or psychedelic-induced experiences or really just the same, but there is a family resemblance. They are similar in some ways and different in other ways. So I think we have to just embrace this ambivalence and just kind of deal with it.
To continue from that one, if there's a family resemblance type of model here, my question would be, well, basically, if you have a psychedelic experience, if you kind of, I'm trying to boil it down into something very plain, is you create the situation where all kinds of associations and accidents can happen. And then something unexpected happens, and that's your experience. That's one model of it. Do you have a model like that that's very simple, and then maybe the mysticism and all the other things are kind of pasted on this experience somehow, and that's then that's the type of field you study then, the things that are sort of on top of the experience, or is it somehow differently integrated?
Thank you for your question. Again, another excellent question. I think it's difficult to kind of always reconcile the thinking of, or to think of models and mysticism, because it's a much more kind of chaotic reality. But I would say that I think that we have to appreciate the notion of experience. But I think it's also important to move beyond this option, and there has been critique on this topic. Is that I think it also kind of strikes a point about how differently people may think about mysticism. So mysticism may mean an episodic experience, which just happens one, and kind of it's transformative in certain ways. But in many religious traditions, mysticism means a path. So it's a preparation, it's kind of testing with both negative and positive results, and then it's kind of gaining certain experiences, then trying to maintain them, and then to be able to live in a certain state of consciousness. So it's a mystic path. So if we talk about mysticism as a mystic path and mysticism as an experience, experience could be kind of part of something bigger. We can also think about mystical consciousness, which can also include the preparation, kind of the experience itself, and transformation, which happens after that.
Thank you so much.